Almost everything you've heard about the Emu War comes from one document written by the officer who lost it, and nobody was sent to check it. He reported 986 birds killed. He also reported roughly 2,500 more that walked away wounded and died later, which is a figure he had no method of counting. Both numbers are still quoted as fact. So start with the moment that should have worked. On the 4th of November 1932, near a dam at Campion in Western Australia, local settlers drove a group of about 1,000 emus toward a concealed position. The gunners waited, the range closed. The Lewis gun fired, killed around a dozen birds, and jammed. I'm the host. We don't do superficial summary videos here, just the facts. So what is this built on? There are real records. Defense correspondence, questions raised in the Australian Parliament, and contemporary newspaper reporting from November and December 1932. The soldier settlement scheme has its own paper trail in state and federal archives. The kill figures are different. They come from Major Meredith's own reporting, so treat them as one interested party's account rather than a count. And the best-known quotes from this story are quotes printed in newspapers, which means they were filtered through a journalist first. I'll flag the difference as we go. Now the part almost every version of this leaves out entirely. The farmers in the Campion and Walgulan districts were not ordinary farmers. Many were returned soldiers who had been given land under a soldier settlement scheme after the First World War. Australia settled tens of thousands of veterans this way. The land they were handed was frequently marginal. The blocks were often too small to be viable, and a large share of those settlers were off the land within a decade. By 1932, the wheat price had collapsed. The Depression was on. The government had encouraged them to plant more and had discussed subsidies that did not arrive as promised. And then the emus came. Emus breed inland and move toward the coast afterward. The wheat belt was newly cleared land with cleared water supplies sitting directly in the path. Roughly 20,000 birds arrived into farms that had no margin left at all, so a group of the settlers went to Canberra, not with a petition about crop damage. They asked the Minister of Defense for machine guns. And that request makes sense in a way the joke version hides. These men had operated Lewis guns in France. They were asking for a tool they personally knew how to use. Sir George Pearce, the defense minister, agreed. And here are the terms which almost nobody mentions. The military supplied the guns and the personnel, but this was not a free deployment. The state and the settlers were on the hook for the ammunition, and there was an expectation that the birds would produce usable skins to offset the cost. Emu feathers had a market. Pearce also approved a cinematographer to accompany the unit and film it. You know, somebody in Canberra expected footage of a success. Major GPW, Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, arrived with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds. Now the animal, because this is where it went wrong before a shot was fired. An adult emu stands close to 2 meters, weighs upward of 30 kilograms, and can run at roughly 50 kilometers an hour. It has a small skull, a long neck, and heavy plumage over a deep body. Hitting one is not the problem. Stopping one is. Multiple accounts describe birds absorbing rounds and continuing to run. The second problem is behavioral, and it's the one that actually beat the guns. Emus do not hold together as a herd under threat. A group under fire fragments outward in several directions at once, individual birds running independently, and there are contemporary descriptions of the flocks appearing to keep lookout birds while the rest fed. That behavior has no counter with a fixed machine gun. The weapon is built to sweep a mass. There was no mass. First contact was on the 2nd of November near Campion. About 50 birds were sighted. The settlers tried to drive them toward the gunners, and the birds split before they closed to effective range. A burst went out at distance, a small number went down, then the 4th at the dam and the jam. 2 mechanical facts explain most of the failure, and both are in the equipment rather than in Meredith. The Lewis is fed by a pan magazine holding 47 rounds and cooled by air drawn along the barrel. It was designed for sustained fire at massed infantry at known ranges. Against scattered fast targets, you are stopping to change pans constantly, and every stop is the several seconds an emu needs to be gone. Then they tried mounting a gun on a truck to chase the birds down. The vehicle could not match an emu across uncleared paddock, and the ride made aimed fire impossible. Firing a Lewis from a moving unsprung truck over rough ground does not produce a burst, it produces scatter. That attempt is reported to have ended with the truck colliding with a fence. The press got hold of it fast, and questions were raised in the House of Representatives. Pierce withdrew the operation on the 8th of November. 6 days later, he sent it back. The Premier of Western Australia and the settlers pushed hard, arguing the birds were still destroying crops, which they were. Meredith returned to the field on the 13th of November and stayed out until early December. And this is where the famous numbers come from. Meredith reported 986 emus killed with 9,860 rounds. That's 10 rounds per confirmed bird from a machine gun. He then added an estimate of around 2,500 additional birds that had been hit and died away from the guns. There was no verification of the second figure. Nobody counted carcasses across open country. I have no way of knowing whether the 2,500 was an honest field estimate or a man improving his report, and I'm not going to pretend I know which. What I will say is that both numbers get repeated with equal confidence, and only one of them was ever countable. Now the strongest argument against the whole framing of this story, and I'd rather put it properly. The operation was not treated as a disaster by the people who lived there. Settlers requested military assistance again in 1934, in 1943, and in 1948. Governments declined every time and gave farmers ammunition instead, which tells you what the state actually concluded. The guns weren't the failure. The guns were the wrong tool for the job, and everyone involved worked that out and moved to tools that were better. And those tools worked. Western Australia introduced a bounty on emus, and in 1934 the number of bounties claimed ran into the tens of thousands within months. The state also relied on the barrier fencing that ran for hundreds of miles across the wheat belt, originally built against rabbits, maintained thereafter against emus. So the total for a few weeks of machine guns is under 1,000 birds. The total for the bounty and fence system that followed runs into the hundreds of thousands over the following decades. The emus did not win anything. Which brings us to the part that's genuinely worth stopping on. The soldier settlers lost, not to birds. Large numbers of them walked off those blocks in the 1930s, and the settlement scheme is generally judged a failure by the people who've studied it, because the land assessments were optimistic, the blocks were undersized, and the debt was structured against men with no farming background. The emus were a visible enemy in a situation that had no other visible enemy in it. You can shoot a bird. You cannot shoot a wheat price or a land valuation made in 1919 by someone who never had to farm it. The men who asked for machine guns were asking for the one form of help the government had already proved willing to hand them. Meredith's own reported line about the birds, comparing their ability to take punishment to that of soldiers, is the quote everyone uses. It went through a newspaper. Treat it as reported speech, not as a transcript. One more thing about the story itself. The word war was press framing from the start, in Australian and then British papers, and the cinematographer Pierce approved meant there was footage. A campaign against a bird got a film crew, an official report, and international coverage. The settlement scheme that put those men out there got none of that. That imbalance is why you know this story, and not the other one. So, the question I'd put to you. The popular version treats the emus as the winners and the army as the punchline. The record shows the birds were killed by the hundreds of thousands within a few years, and the men with the guns were bankrupt within a few more, who actually lost in 1932. Drop your perspective in the comments. One last thing. That fence across Western Australia was built for rabbits, and it didn't hold them either. The rabbit had been introduced deliberately by settlers who wanted something familiar to hunt, from a release of about 24 animals in Victoria in 1859. Within 50 years, it was the most expensive animal on the continent. That's the next one.